I'm very excited to debut these results. This is the first time I've presented on this. The manuscript is almost done. It's all but cleared, and we'll be submitting it soon. So these are fresh, hot off the press. So I am a federal employee. I work for the USDA. I have research that is both internally and externally funded. So the objective of our workshop was a little bit different than today. Our objective was to develop a roadmap to guide more causal, mechanistic, and methodological research, specifically focused on how UPF intake affects obesity and cardiometabolic disease in the US population. And kind of the broader goal was to really promote generation of a more balanced and diverse evidence base, because right now I think most of us know it's heavily observational with 1 or 2 randomized control trials, and really to promote crosstalk across multiple disciplines. So we had experts that represented just a huge variety of disciplines, including but not limited to nutrition, food science, public health, epidemiology. And our goal was to bring together, similar to today, government, academia, and industry. So this was funded by interagency agreement between ARS and NIFA. Kelly Higgins and I led it from the USDA side, and this was truly a public-private partnership. And we had partners from ADM, I'm going to mess up her last name, Katerina Smiljanek, I think, and Rob Berja. And we also had special input from other ADM and USDA folks, including Janice Rueda, Cindy Davis, our national program leader, Andrew Brown and Mario Ferruzzi from Arkansas were great helps in setting up and designing the workshop, as well as Kevin Miller from General Mills. Lydia Comey was our NIFA grant administrator, and she also attended and brought the NIFA perspective to the workshop. And then we were very fortunate to have Sylvia Rowe be our facilitator and our moderator, who really kept us all in check. So as I said, we had people from all the sectors. We had 16 from academia, 6 from private, 10 from government, and then within that we had about 11 early career or trainees. So we had a good spectrum across the career stage. And we were working under what's called the adversarial collaborations framework, which is something that's promoted by ASN. The goal is to bring together quote unquote disagreeing scholars or disagreeing scientists in the spirit of, if we can work together with someone who disagrees with us and we can agree on a research question or a design, then in theory it would be the least biased, because both sides have to agree that that's the study design to move forward. And I really think we achieved a great mix of people to work under that framework. We had people who work with NOVA. We had people who were kind of new to NOVA. We also had people that were involved in the development of NOVA, as well as people who have been very critical of NOVA. So we had a huge span across the NOVA spectrum, for lack of a better term. So this is a session that Kelly Higgins led, and our goal was to basically throw everything at the wall. What are all of the potential mechanisms, potential causal or non-causal, indirect or direct pathways? What are all of the potential explanations of how ultra-processed foods in the middle, I don't know if my pointer, how ultra-processed foods in the middle affects cardiometabolic disease and obesity on the side? And it is overwhelming, and it is a lot, and that's kind of the point, is that this topic is not simple. A reductionist approach is not going to help us answer this question. It involves a lot of different perspectives and stakeholders. I will point out some clusters, though, because we took this conceptual framework that Kelly built out of all of the group discussions and breakout groups that we had. And we kind of sectioned out different pieces of this that then formed our research roadmap. So in the your top left, a lot of that is focused on diet quality. There you see added sugars, nutrient density. Down on the bottom, a lot of that is focused on food environment and societal factors. Up at the top, a lot of that is focused on metabolism and metabolic response to foods. And then kind of in the middle there is a lot of ingestive behavior. There's satiety, there's food form, energy density. So it's a lot, but there's themes there. And so we pulled out those themes to form the research roadmap. So there's six research questions that formed our research roadmap. The first two are focused on more methods development and refinement, really. So the first question is related to the need to have more objective classification methods for ultra-processed food categorization. Some of the ideas thrown around here were focused on very similar to what we saw presented earlier, kind of how do ultra-processed foods cluster? Is it based on nutrients? Is it based on some processing technique? Is it based on formulation? Why are those clustering the way that they do? The second question is focused on how do we improve ultra-processed food intake exposure assessment. And this is really focused on self-reported dietary intake data, because currently many of the databases that we have that relate to intake in the US do not contain the necessary information that you need for accurate NOVA classification. Then there was also a lot of talk about developing different tools specifically to assess UPF intake. And also there was a lot of conversation about the need to standardize how we are measuring UPF intake in different databases. And I think Adam presented a good example of that earlier. The third question is related to diet quality. This is very similar to the Great Debate series in AJCN. Essentially, does NOVA or classifying foods based on processing add any value beyond our traditional diet quality metrics? The next two are, to me, they are related, consequences of each other. So what, if any, attributes of ultra-processed foods affect ingestive behavior, as well as downstream metabolic responses? And the last one is related more to the food environment. So 60%, according to NHANES, 60% of our energy intake in the US is from ultra-processed foods. So are there environmental factors that are affecting purchase? I don't want to say choice because it's often not a choice, but availability of the food in our supply in the US. Some of just kind of my personal takeaways to wrap this up. These are all highly interrelated, and they depend on kind of one another. It's really difficult to design studies for these last three if we're not confident in what we're measuring. You can't really assess the association between X and Y if you don't truly know what you're measuring in X. Also, these, like I said, this is very complex. These questions are not going to be answered by one or two studies. You need complementary studies across multiple methods. So if you're designing an observational study or an observational analysis, work with someone to design a randomized control trial that asks a similar research question. So at least if the results are contradicting or similar, you at least have a little bit of confidence that it's the same research question. And interdisciplinary teams, this isn't something that one lab can do. This is really something that we need to work on together as a field.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. So up next is Dr. Alison Steiber. She's Chief Science Officer for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and she's going to tell us about some work they've been doing.
Okay, well, while they're finding my slides, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me today. It has been very interesting to hear what we know and maybe more about what we don't know. I also want to apologize. You're going to see my slides in hopefully just a few minutes, and I was fairly non-compliant both in my slide template use and in the way I did my conflict of interest, which I will just tell you right now. That I'm an employee of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and I also have a series of grants, but I don't have any other conflicts to declare. Awesome. And I see I can use this. Fabulous. And there's my non-compliant conflict of interest format. So I believe I was asked here today to talk a little bit about the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics perspective on food classification systems, and if we had a position or a stance or a consensus statement, and the answer is short. No, we don't have any of the above. And I think the rationale for that is multitudes of rationale. But today, what you've been discussing really helps get to the core of it. I just don't think we're there yet. And, you know, when we come out with a position statement, it's usually based on a systematic review with a certain level of evidence. So, you know, I think I'm going to show you a little bit of work that we've begun to do to dip our toes in this space. But the reality is we don't have a strong statement one way or the other for our advocacy efforts on food classification systems. But what we are really supportive of course, is a system or any kinds of systems, combination of systems that would help our practitioners educate the public, that would help improve the health and well-being of the population. And that's what we're all here to try and do. So what we did instead is we began with what we often do at the Evidence Analysis Center is we began with a scoping review. And a scoping review, you know, the main point of a scoping review is point one, to examine the extent, range, and nature of available research on a topic or question. So first of all, we wanted to see what's out there in terms of different dietary patterns. And lots of work has been done in dietary patterns, but our practitioners see things like the South Beach diet, or the, you know, people buying packages of meals and eating that as a dietary pattern. And so what we really wanted to do is look at the extensive literature for various different kinds of dietary patterns. So our question was our goal was to identify and characterize studies examining diet or fasting, intermittent energy restriction, IER, you'll see that on my slides, interventions among adults who are healthy or may have a chronic disease, which is basically everybody, except for those that definitely have a chronic disease. So we really tried to keep the inclusion criteria open. I always say when we do these scoping reviews, we just throw the fishing net wide. We just really try to capture all the literature that's out there, and then we can sort it and see where the concentrated areas are that have homogeneity, so we can begin to think about systematic reviews and meta-analysis. In this particular study, our inclusion criteria, we wanted to include systematic reviews, both those with and without meta-analysis. We also included clinical trials, cohort studies, and we looked at a variety of different kinds of dietary patterns or fasting regimes, and you can see we basically included everybody as a population. You can see where we searched. I'm not going to go through that for the shortness of time, and also when we do these kinds of scoping reviews, different than a systematic review where we pull in 6 experts in a particular topic, researchers and clinicians. For this, we just have 2 or 3 content experts that really guide us in our search terms and thinking through what we need to think about in terms of how broad or narrow to throw the net. So we did this, and you can see we captured quite a bit. There were almost 23,000 articles that we touched upon. Of those, once we began to screen them for inclusion criteria, we had about 1,000 full text, so it's a big project. And of those, the 137 met our primary inclusion criteria. And then we also looked at methodological rigor, because that was a secondary inclusion for us. And that brought the number down to 92. We wanted to ensure that they searched more than 3 databases and that they had risk of bias in their systematic reviews. So you can see we had 23 systematic reviews that we included. We were interested in overweight. Those 23 were particularly interested in overweight and or obese, people living with obesity only. Other systematic reviews didn't specify the population by weight category. And I'm not going to go through lots of details, but I am going to refer you to the paper. We have a really nice publication on this that I think does a great job of kind of mapping out where we're at. So what was interesting is through this, we came up with 12 potential categories for these dietary patterns. And some of them I thought were super interesting, like in the regional dietary patterns, we had Mediterranean, which I would have guessed, everybody would guess that, but there were also Nordic and Tibetan. I thought that was kind of interesting. I didn't even know that existed. We looked at restricted or modified fat, restricted high or restricted carbohydrate. We looked at vegetarian dietary patterns, glycemic index, high protein, IER, meal replacement, as I said before, Paleolithic DASH, Atkins, South Beast Zone. We combined those all into one. You can see there's not a lot of research there. And other named or commercial diets. And that included Weight Watchers and Jenny Craig and a variety of other that kind of fell into this bucket. So I love these bubble maps. I think they're both fun to look at, but they're also very informative. And certainly you can see over time how the data, how the different studies have come out. So you can look, let's see if I do this quickly, yep. So 2009 running all the way to 2020, and you can see each bubble tells you, okay, for a meal replacement study, studies, they had one, and it was done in like 2012. That's how you can interpret this. So each line and each color is a different dietary pattern, kind of diet, and then the larger the circle, the more diets there are, the more studies there are that were done on that particular diet. You can see 2019 was a banner year for these kinds of studies. There was a number of them as the circles are very fat and large, and when we got into the pandemic, everything just shut down. So you can kind of get a sense of what they're doing. I think what's very evident is that high or manipulating carbohydrates is a big area of interest. And in fact, we are right now doing an official systematic kind of umbrella systematic review for that. So when you have a whole bunch of systematic reviews, you can do an umbrella systematic review, and that's what we're doing with carbohydrate restriction. We're doing it with vegetarian. We looked at Mediterranean, but there, with the number of high rigor methodological studies, they were very limited. We've also got one going on intermittent energy restriction. So those papers are going to come out following this. This is a heat map that shows what outcomes that they looked at. So we could begin a sense of homogeneity. And you heard Dr. Bailey say this and others, but it's very difficult for people at NESR and other big systematic review places to do quality systematic reviews if you don't have homogeneity in the data, if you don't have similar outcomes that were measured in similar ways and similar interventions. And so this shows a nice heat map of where the data really lies. So again, you can see the different kind of dietary patterns on the top, carbohydrate, fat, vegetarian, etc. And then you can see all the different plethora of outcomes. But obviously the majority are looking at body mass index, glycemic control, blood lipids, and blood pressure. And that's the top marker. The darker the color, the higher percentage of studies that were done on that particular outcome. So we can begin to get some kind of homogeneity as we do the further analyses in these papers. What do we find? We found what you've already heard today. Nothing new, nothing revolutionary. Variation in the definition of diet. That's our biggest stump. We even see that we were looking with a group of people from Europe at malnutrition. We were looking at how people describe what they're doing for interventions for people who have malnutrition in a hospital setting. And the descriptions within the research studies are so poor that you can't even do good systematic reviews with them. We need to do a better job of describing what the intervention is, what the diet is comprised of, the different definitions we use, or we're not going to be able to get good, strong systematic reviews in this space. Variation in comparator diets. As you know, when you do systematic reviews, you have to have a comparator. And the comparator was tons of variability. Again, energy restriction was very loosey-goosey and difficult to define. This idea of focusing on a single macronutrient modification can be troublesome. As described, we don't eat zinc. Did not stratify data by macronutrient percentage is another problem that we had in our analyses. So this is the visual abstract that came out of it. I think it kind of nicely gives you a picture, but you can see the conclusion here. There's an abundance of evidence, dietary approaches and intermediate health outcomes, but there are lots of limitations for us as we move forward. And the dietary guidelines are going to see that as well when they try to look at this for 2025. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Allison. So next up, we have Ana Rosales. She's Senior Director of Government Affairs and Nutrition. She's going to tell us about what the Institute of Food Technology is going to be thinking about in this.
Thank you. So my disclosures are not on here, but it's just that I am an employee of the Institute of Food Technologists, and I am a processed foods consumer daily. So I want to start off with about what the Institute of Food Technologists, what we stand for, and our mission and vision, because I think that'll kind of explain what we think about processed foods and the whole concept of ultra-processed foods. Our vision at IFT is for a world where science and innovation are universally accepted and essential to improving food for everyone. Our mission is to connect global food system communities to advance science of food and its application. That's what we're here for. So I'm going to start off by sharing, if I can keep going, processing. We do not have a formal position on processed foods, ultra-processed foods, or anything like that, but we do recognize this definition of processing, that processing is the same definition that I think we've heard several times today. It's defined as the conversion and preservation of raw materials to create safe, edible, culturally acceptable food products that can be optimized for palatability, health, safety, and it's important and necessary to link between food production and consumption. In short, it is an essential link within the food value chain. Without it, it's broken. Now, a few weeks ago, I think it's been a month now, at IFT, we hosted a roundtable, and the title of the roundtable was Enabling Food and Nutrition Security Through Processing Technologies, and it was to preserve nutritional quality and bioavailability. This roundtable will have an output of a white paper that will be coming, but I want to share with you some of the highlights and the conversations around that roundtable because it's probably the closest thing we have in terms of a position. The first and foremost thing that we had to do when we were hosting this roundtable is kind of what you did this morning, Dr. Decker, where we had to untangle what is processing and what is formulation. Because too often when we're talking about these food classification systems like NOVA and others, they're intertwined and almost meant as the same thing. But this causes a really confusing public health message for consumers and even for scientists, because we can't seem to even agree on this. We have processing on the one side, which is breaking down kind of the different units and turning a raw material into a potential ingredient. And then we have the formulation, which for lack of a better term is the recipe. But systems like the NOVA system, they intertwine these things and cause a lot of confusion. Now, on the right side, you see a chart that uses NOVA as an example, and it has the different groupings, group 1, 2, 3, and 4. But then it also has, in the definitions, which I'm not going to go over because you've heard them several times today as well. But what I want to also show is the left side on this, and this was taken from a Frontiers in Nutrition, and it shows traditional processing technologies and then emerging processing technologies from your raw material down to consumption, preparation, and food waste. You can see that we have some generic things that we're all used to, like canning or thermal processing. But then on the other side, we have some innovations like ozone processing, cold plasma technology. We have high pressure processing, pulsed electric field. We have a lot of different technologies that are emerging right now. And you can see also that they could go potentially across the groups of 1 to 4, depending on the formulation, since it's all intermixed at the moment. So food processing has been shown, though, to improve the food and nutrition security through extending shelf life to help preserve the food for year-round supply, improve food safety, and added value that ultimately helps develop economies. Good food processing practices can ultimately contribute to food sovereignty, the right to people's healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and to help people define their own food and agriculture system. But first and foremost at IFT, we believe in the vision where innovation and science are universally accepted. Why do I say that again? Because we know we have challenges ahead. We know that we have 9 billion people to feed by 2050, that a third of the food is wasted. We know that we can't go forward without processing in all the emerging technologies and in the existing technologies. We have an unknown, uncertain VUCA future ahead of us, whether it's a pandemic, a war, whatever. We need all the tools in our toolbox, and we need to be able to accept the innovation in science universally so we get to a better place for food for everyone. Thank you.
Okay, so everybody's keeping time brilliantly. I've threatened them, apparently. So some more industry perspectives. We're going to have 2 presentations from the consumer packaged goods segment. First, Dr. Christy Remmers, Nutrition and Health Research Fellow at ConAgra.
So thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I feel good about the energy in the room. I was afraid that by 4:17 we'd be a little bit quiet, but Reagan got us worked up, I think, and then we've kept the momentum. So thank you. I think this morning and throughout so far today, we've had some really great high-level perspectives about the value of processed foods and the confusion around classifying those. I think in the next 10 minutes, what I'd like to do is click down a little bit to a very pragmatic view of how maybe bringing light to some of the challenges of an overly broad way of classifying foods when it comes to processed foods. My disclosures are simply that I work for and am a stock owner of ConAgra Brands. So I want to start by showing some of the largest brands of ConAgra. Now, typically, when scientists within the industry talk at scientific meetings, we gloss over this. We don't want to lose credibility, and we don't want to act like we're making an advertisement for our foods. Today, I think, is an exception because these foods represent exactly what we're talking about when we're classifying processed foods. I think everybody has a picture that comes to mind when they hear the word ultra-processed food. For me, this is my picture. I think of frozen meals and vegetables, popcorn, canned vegetables, cake mixes, whipped cream, meat alternatives, and meat sticks, pickles, a whole variety of foods. Certainly, the nutrient density of these brands vary, but on the whole, about 50% of the portfolio ranks as healthy on the Health Star rating, and that's the kind of best in class compared to 11 other competitors. And so these are the foods that consumers are eating themselves and feeding their families every day. And certainly we can leverage these foods to help people eat healthier diets. And by hopefully creating a classification system that's specific enough that doesn't group all packaged processed foods together as one whole can be one way forward. When I think about there are many questions, but when I think about the three top questions that come to mind for me when we think about food classification, these are it. One is to ask the question, does it support innovation, not simply omission or avoidance of packaged foods? Does it accurately classify foods based on their nutrient and food group or food component attributes? And does it promote equal access to convenient and healthy foods? So let's look at each of these. Why is innovation so critical? It's because of the consumer. We know that you can only move consumers so far, so fast. A complete overhaul of diets just doesn't work. We know that large changes in our behavior are usually rejected. If you look at the NPD Eating Patterns in America report, it shows that for the last decade and beyond, we've eaten the same top 10 foods. So we really don't change a lot. And I think that we can only push what consumers will tolerate. And that probably is less than going from packaged foods to scratch cooking. This has been brought up several times today, the fact that consumers are spending less than an hour preparing foods. I think one thing that has not been brought out is those consumers who are spending at least an hour plus are some of the most vulnerable populations, like WIC participants. And so if we are asking for even more scratch cooking from the entire population, we have to recognize that we're asking even more from those most vulnerable populations. And this has also been brought up a few times, that consumers demand taste and price as the first and foremost drivers of their consumption. And that's not related just to packaged foods. That is across the board. And finally, consumers are constrained by time, skills, and resources, not just money and appliances, but also just what else is going on in their lives. Every time I talk to busy moms, they talk about the constraints of time when it comes to feeding the family. What I do know about busy consumers is that innovation works. If we want to help change behavior and nudge them along, innovation is the way to go. Reagan, you brought up that probably the increase in whole grain is due to food innovation. And Jackie, you even mentioned that WHO supports renovation of food. So I think it's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And this case study shows how innovation can really help consumers eat healthier foods. So a stat here shows a healthy frozen meal, Healthy Choice, has grown 7% in the marketplace over the last 3 years, which is notable because other frozen meals have been shrinking. The interest in these healthy foods, amazingly, has been innovation, where consumers were kind of losing their interest in standard healthy food, but we continue to produce these based on the definition of healthy, but then added on the consumer desires, high protein, all natural ingredients, no added sugar, and that brought people back. And so it didn't mandate any change in consumer behavior. They simply could choose this food and eat healthier, as opposed to having that food go away from the marketplace and have to prepare a healthy meal from scratch. What about the consideration of nutrient and food group or food component attributes of the food? You can look at the marketplace and certainly find many foods that would score an A on the Nutri-Score, but are classified as ultra-processed. Some examples are here. Foods that are designed to help people who want to eat heart healthy or even control their calories because of the portion control meals. We have foods that aid people with celiac disease, with gluten sensitivity, those who are managing their blood sugar, those who are wanting more veggies. We know we need more veggies in the diet, more whole grain, there's an innovation, and supporting sustainable vegan and vegetarian diets. So again, the paradox here is that even though these are nutrient dense, they would be classified as UPF, and no matter how much renovation might be happening, they would still be classified as UPF. So it's hard to get the specificity of what's really driving the health outcomes if you have a system that is grouping confectionery products along with meal products. It certainly doesn't give the specificity that we need to know the relationship to health outcomes. And finally, equal access, something that we are all so committed to. How can we achieve this? Connie, I believe you said that fresh and local, I wrote it down. Fresh and local can't feed the masses. And isn't that true? I clicked. So it's a tricky clicker. Okay. So is this a vision of a healthier food system? I think at the core, we're all like, no, this probably isn't the vision of a healthy food system, but sometimes it is stood up as the standard. For example, still several federal nutrition assistance programs require fresh produce be provided. For example, the GusNIP produce prescription program, and still some states require their WIC packages include only fresh produce. And so, you know, the reality is, I think that all of us would agree that all forms and temperature states of fruits and vegetables are necessary to meet people at all skill levels and geographies, so they have access to those at all times and all seasons. And it's true really of any food beyond just fresh fruits and vegetables. And so when I think about this, I do think that if we can broaden the aperture a bit and think of a world where people really will have equitable access to healthy foods, we can not only think of the produce aisle, but also the different temperature states, including frozen, as well as shelf-stable and even healthier snack foods as a vision for the future. And so, again, I end with the thought that a food classification system should support innovation, not omission, of packaged foods, and that the classification should be based on specifics of nutrients and food groups that will, in fact, promote equal access to convenient and healthy foods. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Some more from that sector. We're now going to hear from Dr. Lynn Yu, who is nutrition lead for the Kraft Heinz Company.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Lynn, and I oversee the nutrition function for Kraft Heinz for North America. And I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you, IFINS, for organizing this workshop. And so far, lots of content and good dialogue. here a list of my disclosures and conflict of interest. And then I'm just going to start. I have 4 parts to my overview today. And the first part is really looking and providing an overview to the Kraft Heinz company and some of our ESG-related nutrition commitments. So Kraft Heinz is the 3rd largest food and beverage manufacturer in North America and 5th globally. We have more than $8 billion brands. And, you know, we serve everything from retailers to restaurants to foods on the go in over almost 200 countries and over 200 brands. In terms of our global ESG commitments, we have 3 pillars that really look at every facet of our business. And the 3 pillars are environmental stewardship, responsible sourcing, and healthy living and community support. And you'll see some commitments under all of these pillars. They're not all inclusive, but what I would like to focus on specifically is the healthy living and community support pillar, because that's where all of our nutrition commitments lie. And so we have 5 that we are committed to achieve by 2025. And the first one really looks at improving our product health and nutrition by achieving 85 compliance to our global nutrition targets. We are also looking to reduce sugar in our portfolio globally by more than 60 million pounds. Specifically in North America, we are reducing sodium by additional 5% in barbecue sauce and Kraft salad dressings. We look at improving the use of our ingredients and transparency, and also looking at increasing our plant-based offerings. In terms of our global nutrition targets, we have recently validated these through a publication in Frontiers of Nutrition, and we have focused specifically in this round on looking at category-specific goals and targets for each throughout our portfolio that is based on looking at the public health sensitive nutrients, so the total sugar, the sodium, saturated fat, and calories. This also takes into consideration regulatory considerations, technical feasibility, also portion size and consumer acceptability, and technical challenges from the formulation standpoint. We're also committed to looking at positive nutrition, and I have a few examples that I'll highlight in the next few slides of how we're looking at increasing nutrient density throughout our products. So the first example that I have is back in last year in the summer, we have made a massive renovation by reducing sugar by over 40% on average in our Capri Sun line of juice drinks, and we use monk fruit concentrate to do this. In terms of from a nutrient density and improving nutrient density, we have products that have positive food groups, such as our classical pasta sauces, which include half a cup of vegetables per serving. We have a mac and cheese, which is made from whole grain pasta. And recently, we have developed a Lunchables that will be available through the National School Program, which will provide wholesome options by incorporating more protein and whole grains compared to our retail Lunchables, and it also has reduced sodium and saturated fat. In terms of increasing nutrient density, we have talked a bit about fortification, and here is just one example of fortifying our Deli Deluxe American cheese slices with calcium, which is a nutrient of concern. So in terms of looking at how we want to look at processing and how to address this in our modern food supply, we've gone through most of the advantages of food processing throughout this afternoon in terms of food safety and looking at from a microbiology point of view and increased shelf life. We've talked as well as being accessible and sustainable through many of the presentations, and also being more nutritious. However, if we could focus on the below and the additional value to the food system, in terms of from a convenience standpoint, if we look at how consumers can take foods and beverages from the consumer packaged goods industry, and they can prepare either meals at home, or from a convenience standpoint, have already meals prepared. And we also consider cultural food preferences, budget, and personal preferences. Another additional value to the consumer is about choice. So we really do want to provide options for all consumers to meet whatever lifestyle and wellness goal. Once again, we're selling foods and beverages that contribute to a diet and eating pattern. And lastly, we do know that consumers' taste is king, so it has to be not only familiar and it has to be delicious, but how do we deliver increased nutritional, improved nutrition in very familiar formats? And just in terms of part 3, looking at some of the gaps we've observed in this research, we all know that we eat for different reasons, right? So not only for hunger, but for your schedule, your culture, budgetary constraints, and also your well-being and for the joy of eating. And so if we look at what research gaps exist, these are not inclusive, but the main ones, we're really looking to consider the food matrix when we look at processed food studies. We also need to consider nutrient biomarkers. And also we have talked about in terms of the limited randomized controlled trials right now, and especially in vulnerable groups and groups across life stages. Number 4 is very important, especially to our consumers in terms of, how do we talk about processed food in general and how the tone and what messaging do we use. And this can really help shape behavior and behavioral change. And then lastly, in terms of it's not just about processing, but let's think about the nutrient content and portion size, and not just on specific ingredients while we're thinking about health outcomes. And so, I will end with this. I think, we're here all as part of the workshop, but really to see how does the packaged foods industry segment, how do we partner, whether it's with government or academia in this space. And, I went through the slides quite quickly, so look forward to continued engagement in the question period or throughout this workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn. So the next 2 talks are going to be telling us about ongoing government research, investigating the role of highly processed foods in the diet. So our first speaker is Dr. Julie Hess. She's a research nutritionist at the USDA Grand Forks Human Nutrition Research Center. So she's going to be looking at telling us what they're doing to examine the potential alignment of ultra-processed foods with the dietary guidelines.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, IFANS, to be here today. I'm delighted to be presenting this research that my lab has done. And yes, I'm based at the Grand Forks Center, so Google South Dakota Martini, thank me later. But today I'm going to be talking about a proof of concept study that my lab did to see if we could develop a healthy dietary pattern using primarily ultra-processed foods. So to start off with my own disclosures, this research was fully supported through my employment with USDA. I'm a former employee of the National Dairy Council, and I am an omnivore, and I also eat both unprocessed and ultra-processed foods, per NOVA. So we've gone through this several times today, I know, but to give a really quick background, ultra-processed foods really came on my radar because of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. So this is a proposed topic or question for the 2025 committee to review. And one of the things, of course, that the committee will review in the process of looking at the literature is what definition they want to use when they're looking at ultra-processed foods. And of course, as we've discussed extensively today, the most commonly used scale is NOVA. And it grades foods, of course, on a scale of 1 to 4 from unprocessed foods to category 4 ultra-processed foods. And so as Dr. Drewnowski walked us through earlier, most of the current body of research that they'll find, although we'll have to not include in their literature review because it's cross-sectional, are a wide array of cross-sectional studies and observational studies that largely indicate that increased consumption of ultra-processed foods, mostly per NOVA, is associated with higher added sugar intake, weight gain, total fat intake, saturated fat intake, and more. So there are, for just about any dietary detriment, if you will, that you can think of, there's probably been a cross-sectional study that shows that increased intake of calories from ultra-processed foods is associated with that outcome. But to date, there's only been one randomized control trial, and I'm sure this group is very familiar with it, that actually compared an unprocessed foods diet per NOVA with an ultra-processed foods diet per NOVA. And this is from Dr. Hall's group at NIH. And of course, they did an intervention study where they had 80% of the calories in the intervention diets coming from either unprocessed foods or ultra-processed foods. And they matched these two diets for energy density, fat, sodium, fiber, macronutrients, and energy. And they found, similar to what we see in the cross-sectional studies, that there was higher energy intake and weight gain on the ultra-processed food diet than with the unprocessed food diet. But like all intervention studies, there were some significant limitations with Dr. Hall's approach. And one of those big limitations is that his intervention diets were matched for neither diet quality or micronutrient content. And so I pulled the pictures on this slide are actually from the supplemental files that Dr. Hall included in his paper. And this is the day 6 lunch menu for both, of course, the ultra-processed on the right and the unprocessed on the left. And looking at these two menus, I would expect that the physiological outcomes from eating these two meals, if you were to do it as a test meal, might be quite different, and that probably the nutrient breakdown of these two meals is quite different. And so this brought my lab to wonder, well, could you actually create an ultra-processed menu that matched, say, the nutrient composition of this salmon and green bean and strawberry meal? So we posed the question, can we build a sample 2,000 calorie menu for 7 days that aligns with recommendations from the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, specifically the 2020 Healthy U.S. Style Eating Pattern recommendation, but also has 80% or more of its calories coming from ultra-processed foods according to the NOVA scale? And so our aims were to develop a menu that's comprised of commonly consumed foods by Americans, had a high healthy eating index score of greater than or equal to 90, met the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges, met recommendations for most micronutrients, and also had at least 80% of the calories coming from ultra-processed foods according to NOVA. So of course, our first step was to look at commonly consumed foods by Americans, and this is from the Food Pattern Modeling Report that's released as part of the Dietary Guidelines Scientific Advisory Committee report. So this information is based on NHANES data. These are a couple examples of food groups on this slide, fruit and grains. And I want you to take a minute and look at the most commonly consumed whole fruits by Americans: apples, oranges, bananas, and blueberries. That's about what I would expect to see as the most commonly consumed whole fruits. So our next step is to identify ultra-processed versions of these foods. So remember the whole fruit example. Here you have bananas, oranges, blueberries, and apples that, according to the folks in my lab, were thinking about finding category 4 foods that match these commonly consumed foods, and this is what we came up with. But because there's been some discrepancies in applications of the NOVA scale, instead of just saying, well, this is what we think would be category 4, we actually outsourced that work. We brought in external collaborators and had them grade all of the different foods that we wanted to include in our diet for NOVA categorization. So we brought in 3 experts. We gave them a survey of about, I think it was 200 foods. Got a couple sample questions here. They had received the name of the food. They received an ingredient deck of what was in that food, and they were asked to rate that food on the NOVA scale, 1 to 4. And we asked them to choose the most conservative option. To also make sure, and Reagan, this defies your point a little bit about there being no yes or no questions in nutrition, we actually did give them a yes or no question. Could these foods that we identified that might be part of ultra-processed foods per NOVA, could these be included in food groups that are recommended by the dietary guidelines? So we also had 3 external experts that we worked with who had expertise in dietary guidelines. Most were past committee members, and we gave them the same list of foods, and we said, hey, is this part of the dairy food group of the dietary guidelines? Could this be part of the grains group in the dietary guidelines? So we made sure that all of the foods that went into our final menu were both NOVA category 4 and something that was appropriate for a food group in the DGA. And then we put together our menu using the foods that were rated as both category 4 on NOVA and appropriate in the DGA per our external graders. We used recipes from publicly available resources, USDA MyPlate and MyPyramid. And then we were looking at a 2,000 calorie diet. So in terms of micronutrients, we looked at where for a 2,000 calorie diet, dietary reference intakes for males 51 and older and females 19 to 30, since these are the two age groups the DGA says a 2,000 calorie diet may be appropriate for. And I want to take a minute and pause on the slide. So on the left, you have our ultra-processed DGA menu, what we were calling our DGA Nova menu. And on the right, you have the original My Pyramid menu from the USDA's resources online. And if you're wondering why we use My Pyramid instead of My Plate, the My Pyramid menu was available online at the time, and My Plate menu was not available online, so we went with the publicly available resource. And you'll see there's not a lot of differences between the two menus, the ultra-processed DGA menu and then what's recommended on the USDA website. So anything that has an asterisk on this table is something that we included in our menu that was not in our survey, so we rated it. We said this is, even though something like sparkling water is considered an ultra-processed food per NOVA, we didn't include it in our survey, so we flagged it as a category 1 to 3 food instead. And so when we broke down the menu after creating it, we found that 91% of the calories were from ultra-processed foods, which meant that 9% of the calories came from NOVA categories 1 to 3. All of the macronutrients were within the AMDRs. We met needs for most nutrients, public health concern, calcium, fiber, and potassium. It was a little low in vitamin D, but that's not terribly unusual since it's relatively difficult to have dietary sources of vitamin D. And it was adequate in most micronutrients with the exceptions of vitamin D, vitamin E, and choline. But if you take a deep dive into the dietary guidelines, eating patterns, they are also all fall short in these 3 nutrients. And finally, our HEI score netted out to 86 out of 100, which was lower than we hoped, but not too bad, especially when you consider the side-by-side radar plots of our ultra-processed DGA menu on the left and the typical American HEI score from 2015-2016 NHANES data on the right. So you can see that our ultra-processed DGA menu had excess amounts of sodium and not quite enough whole grains, but it met requirements for all of the other food groups on here for HEI scoring. But then if you look on the right, the only 2 areas that Americans are currently making recommendations for are your seafood and your plant proteins and total protein foods.